This is the brand new Steam Deck OLED, and I have a few questions. First and foremost, what exactly is new? Because it looks pretty similar on the outside. Does this have the performance to keep up in 2024 and beyond? And ultimately, is it worth the upgrade over the original Steam Deck? At first glance, the Steam Deck OLED looks almost the exact same as the original Steam Deck, but the differences go far deeper than just skin deep. That's pretty deep if you're deeper than skin deep. Some might say that's real deep.
No! God, please, no!
Immediately you'll notice the difference in the displays. So both of them are 1280 by 800. However, the OLED, as the name implies, is a far nicer OLED panel. Not only does it get way brighter, 600 nits in standard definition and 1000 nits for games that support HDR, but on top of that, the color and especially the contrast and viewing angles, I mean, it is a night and day difference. On top of that, the Steam Deck OLED does support a 90 Hz refresh rate, which I didn't think was going to be a huge deal, but I'm surprised at how many games I've actually been able to push above 60 FPS, unlike the original Steam Deck, where I kind of left things sort of at 30 or 60 most of the time. These days, the Steam Deck is terrific, but this screen always has felt like a real cost-cutting move to get this thing out the door, and I'm glad that Valve spent the time and the money to have a custom display made specifically for the Steam Deck OLED. It makes a huge difference. Now, beyond just the screen, pretty much every other element of the Steam Deck has been updated, especially when you look at the actual internals of these Steam Decks. What we've got here is a substantially different internal layout. So on top we have the original Steam Deck, which was a very competent device, but the OLED is improved in pretty much every way. So starting out with from the screen, because it's not only that higher quality display, but because it's an OLED, it actually means it's thinner, which means that while the actual physical dimensions of these two Steam Decks are very similar, they were able to pack a lot more in the OLED. Starting out with, actually we've got the battery. So they went from a 40 watt hour to a 50 watt hour battery. So right from the jump, we have 20% larger capacity. They've also shrunk the chip. So the original Steam Deck had a 7nm processor, whereas this has a 6nm chip. It's not a huge difference, but it means it's a little bit smaller and importantly, a little bit more efficient. Between that and the new display, you should expect it to pull a couple fewer watts while you're gaming, and that combined with the larger battery, according to Valve, will give you between 30 to 50% more battery life. It's an interesting choice because when you compare this to like some of the Windows handhelds that have the much more powerful Ryzen Z1 Extreme, those have a lot more sort of theoretical performance and far worse battery life because they are much more power hungry chips. It feels like Valve were very much conservative with this Steam Deck OLED because it is a difference. It's certainly going to give you more battery life, and I've noticed that as well, but you're not seeing a lot more performance. I actually personally think that's a pretty reasonable trade because they've also paired that with a lot of other things to make this a more refined experience. The Steam Deck OLED feels like the last couple of years, they've pretty much entirely been focused on making a fully upgraded Steam Deck, and the amount of little tweaks and tuned things and like the stuff that they've done here to improve it is truly impressive. I mean, no, does it make the LCD completely irrelevant? Absolutely not. But there is not a single thing I can say looking at the Steam Deck OLED compared to the original, which is not an improvement. Like literally, everything is different. Everything has been tweaked and tuned, even if it's a tiny little difference of like, it's dumb, but look, they like color matched the ribbon cables. It went from white and blue to black. Does that matter at all? No. Does it show that someone at Valve really cared about every little element of this thing? Yes, it does. And when you compare that with what Sony did with the PS5 Slim, which if you haven't caught that video, would highly recommend it because essentially the PS5 Slim has also done a sort of similar transformation going from a 7 to a 6nm processor, and they've kind of shrank things down. But every element of that PS5 Slim is cheaper, 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 cheaper. This is technically more expensive, but only by a few bucks. We'll get into the pricing a little bit, but it's clear that like there was some real love and attention that went into this that certain other console makers could probably take some notes on. Valve are not claiming any performance uplift going from the Steam Deck to the Steam Deck OLED. However, the OLED does have faster memory. So we're going from 55 to 6400 megatransfers a second. And with these AMD APUs, which are incredibly memory hungry, that actually should make a noticeable difference. I mean, nothing crazy, but maybe a couple extra frames per second going to this new OLED, which when you combine that with the cooler, quieter fan, the better battery life, etc., I mean, it just does make it a slightly faster and better overall refinement experience. Better overall refinement experience. That's the quote. You can put my name on it. Now, when it comes to actually buying a Steam Deck OLED, a question I think a lot of people are gonna have is that if you already have a Steam Deck, is it worth the upgrade? Now, this is, by all accounts, a classic mid-cycle slim style refresh. And I think for most people, your existing Steam Deck is great. But if you've got the disposable capital, it actually is a pretty solid update even over the original Steam Deck. Yes, of course, it is not going to be a significantly more powerful console, but that screen and even like little details, like I'm sitting here just like scrolling around on a web page and the preciseness I can get with the touchpads and whatnot, like there are so many little updates across the board, not only of course counting the better Wi-Fi, the better battery life and the screen and whatnot. It's actually not a completely crazy thing to trade your old Steam Deck in and buy an OLED. But I want to be clear, no one has to do that or really should do it. But it's a lot better than going from like a PS5 to PS5 Slim, which makes sense for literally no one. Where things get a little bit more complicated is if you don't already have a Steam Deck and are looking to buy one, because there are actually now 5 Steam Decks to choose from. So going on the Valve site here, first of all, you'll see the 3 options. So the LCD, which comes in at $399 with a 256 gig SSD. But keep in mind that this is completely unchanged. This is the original Steam Deck that they're continuing to sell. On top of that, you've got the 512 gig OLED model, which is $549. And you can go up to the 1 terabyte OLED for $649. And that also, which is the model I have here, has the anti-glare display. Now between the 3 of these, I would actually lean a little bit more toward the 512 gig OLED. It's nice, of course, to have the 1 terabyte of capacity, but I'm not a huge fan of the anti-glare coating. That anti-glare coating, to me, makes the screen a little bit less sharp and also kind of mutes some of the colors. I think this looks phenomenal as is, but I guarantee you that if I had the OLED with the glossy panel in front of me, I would think it would look even better. A matter of personal taste, but to me, the $549 model is where it's at. Or if you want the more budget alternative, getting a 64 gig Steam Deck, either new or used or refurbished, and putting a little bit of money into the upgrades gives you almost the same experience. You know, it's not quite as nice, but a very similar experience for less than $350. Like, that is crazy to me. My number one question about the Steam Deck OLED is performance related. When the Steam Deck first came out, it was quite powerful, but that was a couple of years ago, and the goalposts have certainly moved. And I'll say in my own personal experience with the Steam Deck, there's certainly some AAA titles that are starting to push the envelope on what the Steam Deck can really run comfortably. There's a lot of settings I have to turn down farther and farther. So does the Steam Deck OLED fix this? Well, in short answer, no. While the memory is slightly faster, if a game ran poorly on the Steam Deck, it is going to run poorly on the Steam Deck OLED. Now, that's not always true, so take Baldur's Gate for example. Not only has the game seen a number of patches as well as SteamOS, but also the performance is just so much better. Like originally, I was struggling to hit 30 FPS. Now on this Steam Deck, I've been operating it with a 45 FPS cap, and it holds fairly well. You can see in these outdoor areas we're dipping into the 30s, but for most of the game, I can actually lock it at 45 FPS. 45 Hz works well for a lot of games that are a little bit more demanding because it is half of 90 Hz, so you get very nice smooth frame pacing, assuming you can hit 45 FPS. But for some games, like I'll show you in a minute, you actually can hit 90 FPS, or at least well above 60, which does show off that fluidity. Something else I want to show is the HDR brightness. So you can see there's a little tab here for Baldur's Gate which shows HDR. If I turn this brightness up, it hits a ridiculous 1000 nits. It is so bright. Like honestly, I mean, it looks terrific, but it is brighter than I would want to play with any kind of regularity. It is just, oh, I'm on fire now. It is just so bright. But it just goes to show that Valve made a good call in getting a fully custom OLED display for the Steam Deck because it looks terrific. Like, I would say that this is more impactful than having a more powerful processor. And especially if we switch over to a game that can take advantage of the full 90 Hz, as I get stuck, you'll really see what this thing can do. I'll be honest, running Forza Horizon 5 on this is kind of impressive. So here I'm running with a mix of medium settings and FSR turned on, and I'm seeing 70 to 80 FPS, which really flexes the capability of this display. Now, sure, it's not going to be the HDR showcase that Baldur's Gate is. The HDR does not work in Forza Horizon 5 at the moment. But even running an SDR at the lower peak brightness, I'm legitimately impressed. Like, it looks terrific. While these examples are, I would say, generally pretty impressive, I can't deny that there are other titles that are still going to struggle to run on the Steam Deck. And when you look at the other competition out there, the ROG Ally, you've got the Legion Go, not only do they have roughly double the performance, just raw power with the Z1 Extreme chips, but on top of that, they don't have the added overhead of SteamOS. Look, I love SteamOS. There's a ton of advantages there, but it's pretty much always running games through a compatibility layer with Proton. It's a damn miracle that Proton works at all, I'll give you that, but there's a little bit of an overhead. You lose a little bit of your peak performance because you are doing that translation, and when you have half the performance of those Windows handhelds, you're inevitably going to have to make some compromises. Which really got me thinking, what happens if you install Windows on a Steam Deck? Does that magically give you a performance benefit? And is it remotely worth it? Here's the thing, I actually started working on this video a few weeks ago before the Steam Deck OLED had even been announced. So I've got some thoughts. The first thing to know is that if you install Windows on your Steam Deck, it requires you to reformat the drive and completely get rid of SteamOS. And same thing, if you want to switch back to SteamOS, you gotta reformat and get rid of Windows. So as of right now, with recording this video, there's no dual boot support for SteamOS and Windows. Valve say they're working on it, but they've been, to be fair, working on it for quite some time. So first impressions with the Steam Deck running Windows have been very mixed. The Windowsy bits are annoying. Now, this is not really a Steam Deck specific thing, but dealing with the on-screen keyboard is not good. And I've had multiple issues with the Steam Deck where it didn't want to pop up. I had to, at one point, I couldn't log in. I couldn't get past the lock screen because the keyboard would not pop up, so I had to restart. It's really, really finicky. I'll say that I have these problems with most Windows handhelds, but it does seem like it's a little bit worse on the Steam Deck. That being said, there are, of course, advantages, one of which is the compatibility. So you're no longer bound to generally just Steam games. Actually, one of the big things for me is taking advantage of Game Pass games. So because I already pay for Game Pass Ultimate, I can't install those natively on SteamOS, but I can install those natively on a Windows device. The problem, though, coming back to our janky discussion, is that for some reason, out of the box, Windows thinks that the Steam Deck controllers is a mouse and keyboard. And so in something like Forza, it doesn't work. What I will say has been actually really impressive is playing Baldur's Gate 3. Now, this is a game that I've played fairly extensively on the Steam Deck running SteamOS, and I know that while it doesn't run well, it is playable there. But this is kind of what I was hoping for. Even though there are certainly a lot of disadvantages to running Windows on your Steam Deck, the advantage is, well, theoretically, in games that are in Steam working, which I haven't got that fully up and running yet, but on top of that, games that are not really optimized for SteamOS, that are optimized for Windows, should deliver far better performance. So it's still very much early days, there's a lot more tweaking and tuning I want to do, but the gist of it is this. Windows does work on the Steam Deck, but it's kind of janky, and there's going to be a lot more tweaking and tuning I'm gonna have to do to get this to be a playable state. Whereas of course, if I was running on SteamOS, everything would just kind of work. Look, if Valve turns on the ability to dual boot tomorrow, I would strongly consider it on my Steam Deck. But as of right now, it is too drastic of a change. It's just not worth it. When you compare the Steam Deck OLED with the other handheld PCs out there, price is a major factor. So on the lower end, the Steam Deck LCD I think is a terrific deal. Again, when you're talking about this thing at $350 or less with a little bit of upgrading, terrific value. Now at $550, the Steam Deck OLED is fairly priced, I will say. It is certainly a little bit harder to justify than, you know, maybe the older $400 model where you can just throw an SSD in. But $550 I think is very fair for the 512 gig version when you consider that its competition is about $700. Technically, you could actually get the Ally for slightly less, but generally speaking, we're talking about $700 over here versus $550 for the Steam Deck. And I will say that I will take the Steam Deck OLED over either of these. It's not too much of a competition. Yes, there's more performance here, but Windows is janky. Right? It's just not as seamless of an experience. Now, if I had the ability to load up SteamOS on these devices, I think it's a much more compelling setup. Or, assuming that Windows ever gets their shit together and actually designs an OS that feels good on a small touchscreen, that's a different story. But I can only evaluate what I have today, and the Steam Deck OLED is done terrifically well. So ultimately, is the Steam Deck OLED worth it? In a word, yes. Is it perfect? No, of course not. No product is. And the performance does give me a slight bit of pause on a full glowing recommendation because it is very usable today. Don't get me wrong. Like, I have found that, especially with the 90 hertz and the ability to adjust your frame rate targets, it is still very competent. But as time goes on and as more games demand more and more power, it is going to start falling behind. That's fine, and I think that that's a reasonable trade-off considering that this has far better battery life than the other options out there. It is cheaper. It has, even though it's not quite as high resolution and high frame rate of a display, ultimately the OLED absolutely carries this display to being the best on any handheld console. Like, it is rare to see a device get so much better in so many ways from one generation. Like, Valve have done something special with the Steam Deck OLED. I'm sure you've seen other videos talking about why it's great. I tried to go into it being a little bit more skeptical, but I'm completely sold. Like, it is the move if you were looking for a handheld PC. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring-a-ling that ding-a-ling button. If you excuse me, I'm gonna go grab my deck and have a great time.
We're gonna get demonetized.